in the area of the Praetorium. And I'm going to have Willie do some contribution here too, because we have two handouts here. We have the heavy hand of the law, this one, and we have the other one, which is showing the gated area of the Praetorium. Okay, so there are two pages, and Shimon Gibson, who has taught at UHL for many years, archaeology, and also ran the graduate seminar. He's in North Carolina, right? He is particularly tied to this site in terms of excavating everything that's behind the wall here, which is in the Armenian Quarter, and it's a parking lot.
And this side also.
Yeah, and on this side.
He excavated this side in the 70s and 80s.
When he was a young
teenager.
a young kid. Okay, now over here we have part of the gate, and just over where I think it's an almond tree, is the remains of the closed-in gate. Is that right, Willie?
Well, we'll go up there and look at it.
Okay, we'll look at it. Good. And Herod's palace pretty much took up, according to Josephus, it went from the three towers over there where you see the citadel of David, the three towers that Herod had built, and extended all the way to the south. Now, in Second Temple period, the wall, the southern wall, went more south than it is today, okay? And so when you want to see remains of that wall, you have to kind of go down on the road, and on the embankment going down to the road are remains of the second wall on the southern side. So this part of the city was called the Upper City. This is the highest point of the city, and it says, Josephus Flavius says that Herod had built a grandiose palace in this area, this southern part along this western side of the wall, okay? And it was so grandiose. It had gardens and porticos and pools and places for doves and everything you can imagine in this palace. And along with all of that, as Herod would do with his structures, is he also had a praetorium. Now in Caesarea, in Caesarea, you see this really clearly what Herod did. His palace extends out into the sea, and right east of it, behind it, attached to it, is the praetorium. Okay, now the praetorium functions kind of like the ancient gate, and it also has some sort of correspondence to what was going on in the basilica of the city, which was, it was a place for the military to have their offices. It was a place, it was a law court, and there were also prison cells. So when we talk about the Apostle Paul being held in Caesarea under the different procurators, he was staying in the praetorium, and it even says in Acts that he was brought to the praetorium. The praetorium is actually, the word is actually used there. Now, Josephus doesn't use the word, but he talks about a platform of judgment. And this is, he refers to this with Florus. Florus was one of the Roman rulers that was ruling over Jerusalem after, in what we call late Roman period, and he judged people here, and he had them crucified and so forth. And he judged them on the platform, the judgment platform called a bematos, okay? And I just had my index cards. What did I do with them? Here they are. I want to give you some references so you can check what I'm saying to you. In Jewish Wars, Josephus' Jewish Wars, in book 7.
Sorry, what's the reference?
Huh?
What was the reference?
Jewish Wars.
Oh.
Josephus, Flavius. Okay, we have the mention of the bematos in book number 7 and number 6. We have mention of the palace in book number 5, around 182 and 183. We have the mention of Florus as he was in the palace, and he had a bema, that's a bematos, built on the temenos, and that's where he sat in judgment, and that is war in the 2nd book. And then also in the 5th book, around 468, book number 5 in Jewish Wars, Josephus talks about this magnificent palace that Herod not only built the Antonio, or the Antonia fortress, which is actually called a Frurion in German. I'm not German, Greek. It's so far as distracting me. It was a Frurion, and that's mentioned a couple of times in this particular book 5, around 468 in that area. If you read around, and there's a whole chunk where he's talking about the upper city, he's talking about the palace, and he's comparing it to the Antonio fortress, which was also very palatial and very beautiful. And it had a praetorium. So,
the Antonio fortress also had a praetorium? Is that what you're saying?
It had, well, it had a place for military barracks.
Yeah.
And those soldiers were patrolling the Temple Mount.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was like a praetorium.
What's a praetorium? What does it mean in English?
A praetorium would be like a civil, a military civil administration building.
It actually has different meanings in different time periods.
Yeah.
It kind of started as a military barracks, and then it becomes more the way that we're describing it now.
So this is the question that everybody has. Now, what happened was, over the course of history after the apostolic period, after the Holy Spirit fell in Jerusalem, after the gospel went out everywhere, after the church expanded into Asia Minor, etc., what happened in Jerusalem is later on we have the development of Christians or believers in the way coming to Jerusalem and going to the places that they remember in the whole gospel account. Now, the first place, of course, is where Jesus was crucified and buried, and where he rose again from the dead, And the early church in Jerusalem was primarily Jewish, okay? So Jews were not really inclined to build shrines because they had the temple, okay? And there was no point in building a shrine to Jesus because that just wasn't Jewish culture, you know. It was like, you know, you're erecting a shrine to an idol or something. But they did remember all of these events, and they remembered it at the site. Now, and because they didn't build anything, it was very easy for those who came after to be able to erase the identity of the site, okay? Are you all getting hot? You want to shift to the shade?
There's no seat.
Huh? You're okay?
It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
All right. So try to follow my thinking here. Okay, so after the apostolic period, we have this Caesar Hadrian who comes into town. He's actually making a whole trip right on down the Levant. And his primary purpose, or his agenda, is to renovate and rebuild cities and bringing them back to the height of pagan Roman piety, meaning bring everybody back from these heretical religions and bring them back to the shrines and the idols that once ruled Rome. Okay, so this is Hadrian, and what he does literally is come in and he levels things that he doesn't like, and he erects things that he feels that everybody should have. And basically he rebuilt Second Temple period Jerusalem, and seagull. Okay, he rebuilt Jerusalem, and what he did was one of his policies was that Jews were troublemakers. They had caused the first revolt that destroyed the temple, and he wanted them out of Jerusalem. And there was a revolt against him, led by Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba. It was called the Second Revolt, and it was unsuccessful. And so Hadrian really had a basis for deporting all the Jews out of the area. And so what happened was all the Jews were commanded to leave Jerusalem and the province of Judea. They had to get out of Judea. And he renamed Jerusalem after his family name, Aelia Capitolina, and he renamed the province of Judea, Palestina. And this is where we get that official name. And the policy was no Jews allowed, period, okay? That changed the character of the city. Any Jewish site was then erased, and whatever had been there, it became sort of the foundation for a new temple. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, being just an area where Jewish Christians were remembering Jesus and and the tomb and the resurrection and so forth, he built a temple to Aphrodite, okay? And he erected some sort of thing on the Temple Mount to Jupiter, and he went around doing this to every site that had anything to do with the gospel. The church in Bethlehem became a temple to Tammuz. The church in Ein Kerem, that remembers John the Baptist and where he grew up, there was a temple there. And so wherever Gethsemane, there was also some sort of pagan shrine there, and on the Mount of Olives. So he basically, his intention was cover it all up and put his own thing in its place. Now, people remembered all of this, and I'm talking about Christians, and if you read in Eusebius' History of the Church, you'll read about this, what Hadrian did, because later on we find a restoration taking place of these sites in the early Byzantine period by Constantine's mother, Helena, and we'll get to that later. So anyway, Hadrian changed the city plan. The walls, the city's much smaller than the Second Temple period city, and he really emphasizes the Cardo, the Agora. As you can see, it runs right up, straight on through. There are two Cardos, so you have lots of straight streets. You've got the grid, the Decumanus, and then you have a giant shrine to himself in Damascus Gate. Now today, if you hear the name of Damascus Gate in Arabic, Bab al-Mud, that means the gate of the column. And he had erected an image of himself on a column in Damascus Gate, okay? So that's how, and interesting enough, in East Jerusalem, in the Arab culture, in Arabic, Jerusalem is still referred to as Elia. So it's very, very interesting that a lot of these Hadrianic things that he introduced into the city, and by the way, over here where Herod's palace was, and the Three Towers, was a major Roman legion called the 10th Roman Legion. They were living and parked and camping here. So this became, Herod's beautiful palace was basically destroyed, and it was replaced by this 10th Roman Legion camp. Now, the Western Wall tunnels. Have you all been in those tunnels?
Yeah.
No, not yet?
No.
Okay, it's really important that you go in and get the tour and everything. What they're discovering along that wall, which connects the Western Wall to the rest of the upper city, is they have discovered like a big Roman bathhouse from the time of Aelia Capitolina, with a water source and all, with big pools. There's a mikveh there from even before Second Temple period, and what they did was they came in and they built over all of that. They built a very fancy bathhouse for themselves. Okay, so that's what they've been working on of late. If you go in, not just on a regular tour, but if you can go in and ask them to see all the archaeology, the new stuff, the bathhouse and the Hasmonean area, that's really important. It's just right adjacent to that wall that connects, and I'll try to point that out today. Okay, so that's Hadrian and Aelia Capitolina, and it's really important for us to understand because Hadrian actually changes the way people think. You know, they get used to his city, they get used to his buildings, they get used to those temples, and they forget, especially in the time just after when he came, and even in the Byzantine period, they had no recollection of history like we have today. They were thinking only as far as the Gospels and not the whole foundation of the city of Jerusalem. And so they became confused. And this is part of the problem with theology today. You hear that term replacement theology. This really comes from the Byzantine period, which was actually not relying so much on serious research into the past, but really creating sites for themselves for their pilgrimage. Okay? Because what happened was in the Byzantine period, which comes sometime after Hadrian, Hadrian comes through here, and by 135 the city is turned over and it's being rebuilt. And then about a couple of hundred years later comes the Byzantine period, and they are still adhering to Hadrian's policies. No Jews allowed, and this is a Christian city, and it's based on the Gospels, and we have nothing to do with the Old Testament. Well, actually they did use it, but they used it for themselves to create the new Israel, because what happened was the Byzantine church became the new Israel of God. And so it didn't matter to them if a site was not historically correct. It just mattered that it would be good for their pilgrimage sites. And so you find that geography is getting manipulated in this period as a result of what Hadrian began. Okay? And that's something important to remember, because when we go, we're going to go up here and around through Zion Gate, and we're going to stand in Mount Zion, and I'm going to explain to you why it's the fake Mount Zion and not the real Mount Zion. Okay, so just like we have a fake praetor, I shouldn't say fake, because there were Roman soldiers over in the Antonia fortress. But what happened was, with the pilgrimage culture, okay, we started in the Byzantine period. 325 is when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is dedicated, and then we go on, and we have, in the Byzantine period, we have a Via Dolorosa. The Via Dolorosa in the Byzantine period runs along the Cardo from Zion Gate, okay? From Zion Gate. So we're going to go through Zion Gate, and we're going to walk on the Cardo as much as we can to get the idea of their pilgrimage route. Then, with the Crusaders who come in 1099, we have a new Via Dolorosa being laid out, and that one, because really the big pilgrimage for the Byzantine Christians was that you started in Gethsemane. Well, you went to Bethlehem, then you came to Gethsemane, you went up on the Mount of Olives, and then you processed over to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by way of the Cardo, following that Hadrian plan. With the Crusaders, you get the idea of them coming through the Eastern Gate, which was open at a certain time of the year, and they processed over the Temple Mount, straight on over to the Holy Sepulchre. And if you go up on the Temple Mount and you stand there, you can see that the Holy Sepulchre is almost straight ahead. If you stand in a certain area, you'll see that it would be a straight walk right to the church. Now, when the Mamelukes came to power, this is 1260, remember the Mamelukes? They wanted nothing to do with the Christians. Nothing, and they shut down the Temple Mount. They said no more coming across the Temple Mount. And so the Franciscans, who were at that time the custodians, they were appointed, interestingly enough, by the Mamelukes to take care of all the holy sites, quote unquote, the pilgrimage spots. And what they did was they established a new Via Dolorosa. So the new Via Dolorosa begins in the 13th century. And they lay it out as going around the Temple Mount. So, you know, you go on it today and you're on the northern part of the Temple Mount, and then you turn left and you go down the Valley Road, and then you have to make a right-hand turn to go up the hill, and then another left-hand turn, and then you get to the church. And the former entrance of the church was from the Cardo, through a bakery that exists there now today.
When is it established? Nowadays, the other roads.
What?
13th century.
Okay.
13?
The one that is the Cardo today
Yeah.
is established in the 13th century.
No, the one, the Via Dolorosa.
What did I say?
You said the Cardo.
Via Dolorosa.
So it's the Via Dolorosa. Yeah. The Via Dolorosa that we have today was established in the Mameluke period in order to bypass the temple. And so this is how it gets going. And so then they pinpoint, they say, well, Jesus had to be judged over in the Antonio fortress. So then the Sisters of Zion have a whole site called Gabata, Litos Strotos, and you know, everybody goes in there and they go through, and you know, it's a place of prayer and pilgrimage, but it's actually, the pavement down there belongs to Hadrian's Victory Plaza. Because he, around his column where he erected a statue to himself, he had a major victory plaza with arches, victory arches, and you can see part of the arch going over the Via Dolorosa.
And it says Homo Echo, doesn't it?
Ecce Homo.
Ecce Homo.
Yeah, from John 19.
I have a question about the time for the Hadrian. You said they came in
132.
132.
Yeah, this is when he's having this
Okay,
journey in the Levant where he
okay.
causes the uproar. And you can see the effect of Hadrian's visit to the land, that it's reverberating today in our politics, in our understanding of people groups, in our understanding of, you know, geography. It's all mixed up as a result of this. And that's why we have good researchers and geographers and archaeologists who are doing many different things. And so one of the really fine scholars who mentions the Praetorium is Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who was formerly at École Biblique, and he passed away a couple of years ago. He's written a book called The Holy Land. I really recommend it as a, you know, a reference book. And he has all those references from Jewish wars, which really helps us to understand, okay, when Jesus was sent from the house of Caiaphas, he was brought to Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate was in the palace, in Herod's palace. They did not, the governor or the procurator who lived in Caesarea, they did not go to a military barrack when they were coming to Jerusalem. They came to a nice palace. This is where they would be.
So they lived together in that place? Herod and Pontius.
No, Herod was dead by the time Pontius Pilate.
Herod died in 4 BC, and then afterwards there's people who...
But Herod built the palace. He built the palace. Okay. Let me stop. Do any of you have questions? Are you confused by what I'm saying? You have any comments?
Well, we can go over the archaeology a bit.
Yeah, we will. Well,
when you're ready.
Willie's going to do the archaeology part to this site.
So,
yeah.
So the Praetorium will also be at Herod's palace?
Yes,
And
attached
No,
to Herod's palace.
It's attached. The Praetorium's over here, the palace. The palace is over there by the towers.
Yeah.
In between you have a garden, which is this section, and right about there is where the Praetorium starts.
Yeah,
Right, gotcha.
if you look at the handout, you can kind of see.
Inside.
If you look at the handout, you can kind of see that there is. You have to the left, you have the palace, and he had many different halls to receive people, and porticos and outdoor gardens with pools, and it was very luxurious.
Right.
So this is the palace area, and this is the praetorium area.
Right.
Okay, and then the bematos would have been out here, so the people would see, and then Pilate would have sat in judgment on the bematos.
What is Bematos?
That's the raised platform of judgment.
Usually bematos in the praetorium.
Well, according to Josephus, Florus, who was a ruler that came afterwards for in the late Roman period, he erected a bematos, which is a raised platform. He sat on it and judged. That gives us a picture of what Pilate did. Now, did Pilate have a permanent bematos with stone paving stones, or was it a temporary bematos that he had built, or we don't know? What do you think?
Well, we can actually see some of the parts of these reconstructions based on.
Okay, good. So Willie's gonna deal with that. What I want to do, I want to get to the garden tomb. What? Go ahead.
In terms of the Via Dolorosa,
Yeah.
so what you mean is Jesus just went through the east gate?
No. Jesus, okay, if we're all in agreement, after Willie gives us the archaeology, and I've given you the history and the references from Josephus, if we agree that this is the site of the Praetorium, Jesus is led away to Golgotha in this direction, either from inside the wall, this wall, or from the outside of the wall. We don't know, but he goes in the direction of Jaffa Gate, and the second wall begins at Jaffa Gate. If you look on the Second Temple period map, I'm going to do a route here in blue. Okay, I have a kind of
I was just gonna say.
you want to alter?
No, I just wanna. The first part usually they go from the Garden of Gethsemane to there and then to here.
Okay, but we
And,
want what we want to do is we want to do the Herodian quarter. So we'll put the Herodian quarter on the map, which is right here.
Okay.
So that might have been where Caiaphas was. So he would come here. Okay, he would have come
Here and then
Gethsemane,
through
come
the
to the
city.
Watergate,
Right.
up to
Yeah.
the Herodian quarter, and then over
Yeah.
to Herod,
Yeah.
and then so.
Yeah.
What map is that? Is that this one?
Yeah. Okay. Now, we're going to do a whole drawing of from the time when Jesus is arrested. But right now, we're just doing the Praetorium, which is here. Okay. And he's either going like this, or he's on the outside of the wall. And he comes around, and the second wall begins here, and simply he comes around to Golgotha, which is right here. So the tomb is, according to what I've read of Israeli archaeologists, and by the way, Israeli archaeologists are convinced that it's the Holy Sepulchre. So they're saying, 99% archaeologically, they believe it's the Holy Sepulchre. Okay. So we come around to, this was a stone quarry in Jesus' time, outside the old city wall, outside the city walls, and it was a mountain that kind of sloped down, and at the bottom of the hill, new tombs had been hewn out. They had been carved out of the limestone.
So the thing you have to know about this map, this is just before the destruction of the Second Temple period, not
Right. This
this
is the
third wall comes after Jesus' death.
Right.
So you have to know that at the time of Jesus, this wall is not there.
Yeah. So this is the wall right here. The second wall is
So
right here.
the time of Jesus, it looks like this. Okay, this is extremely important for this example.
And what happened?
And here's the garden tomb. I mean the
Holy-
the Holy Sepulchre.
Yeah.
I keep
Right.
So if that's the route like going out, like from outside of the city, and then what's the route if they go like from
Well,
inside of the city?
if the way of the cross, I'm sort of convinced that it was on the outside of the city wall, because he would have been really at a point of defilement, because all the houses just east of Herod's palace were priestly houses, and it would have been very defiling to have someone bleeding and dragging, you know, which is probably one of the greatest shames and dishonors in the Torah, is to be hung on a tree. And so for him to walk through the priestly quarter, probably, you know,
right before Passover.
right, probably would not have happened.
That's why they wanted him on the tree, because it says in the Torah that whosoever hangeth upon a tree is cursed. And that's why God wanted him there. He wanted him to be cursed for our sins.
Okay.
Was there a gate on there?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Willie's he's gonna talk about the gate now. And see, this is a really good place to do a lot of talking, because once we get inside the walls of this city, it becomes very noisy, and there are lots of people around. It's really hard to concentrate. So I want to give you as much as possible here before we start walking around.